Hello everyone and welcome to the start of the 23rd season of the HistoryNetwork.org podcasts. Now, in a moment we will kick off with episode 1, which has been written by a listener, just like you. We really do love getting your ideas for scripts, so why not share some of your knowledge with other listeners too and write a script? There's no need to feel daunted by it because we can give you a hand and help get the script done. So why not give it a go or drop us a line at info@thehistorynetwork.org and chat to us about your idea. You can always like our Facebook page as well to follow what we do and make sure you don't miss anything. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 23, Episode 1, 1763, The Battle of Bushy Run. This episode was written by Doug Nipple. Doug is a high school physics teacher who lives a few miles outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Growing up in one of the major areas of early American history, it was only a matter of time before he became obsessively interested in it. Fort Duquesne, a French outpost fort in present-day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was strategically placed where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers merge into the Ohio River. The Ohio then flows into the Mississippi River, producing an important waterway linking Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. The capture of Fort Duquesne was a focus of the British in North America during the 7 Years' War. The American theatre is also known as the French and Indian War. The first attempt to capture Fort Duquesne ended in tragedy for the British in 1755. General Edward Braddock built a road through Virginia to carry his men and supplies to attack Fort Duquesne. Braddock was the senior commander in North America at the time and devised a four-pronged attack on the French. Fort Niagara, Crown Point, Lake Champlain, Fort Beausejour in Nova Scotia, and Fort Duquesne all would be attacked that summer. Braddock personally commanded the attack on Fort Duquesne. As he neared his target, he left most of his supplies behind and created a flying column to try and quickly reach the fort. The French and natives rushed out to meet him and slaughtered the column about 10 miles short of their goal. The British fought using battle lines and exchanged volley fire with the French regulars, while the natives surrounded the British lines and fired from cover. Casualties began to build as the natives poured musket fire from the cover of the tree line into the exposed British troops. Eventually their lines dissolved and the British retreated in panic back along the road. Braddock was wounded and eventually died in the retreat. In the second attempt to take Fort Duquesne, British General John Forbes and his second-in-command, Colonel Henry Bouquet, built a road across Pennsylvania in 1758. This time the British built forts and outposts at regular intervals and were more cautious in their approach. They completed Fort Ligonier in August of 1758, about 15 miles east of Fort Duquesne. This was within attacking distance. By this time Forbes was seriously ill and not even able to be on horseback. He would be transported on a stretcher slung between two pack animals. Troops rallied around his sense of duty in the face of his sickness. In September, Major James Grant left Fort Ligonier in another attempt to attack and take Fort Duquesne from the French. However, this went horribly wrong, and Grant had to retreat with heavy casualties. By November, word started to come to the British at Ligonier that the French were starting to abandon Duquesne. The French had too small a contingent of troops stationed there to resist the increasing numbers that the British were sending west. Forbes moved forces west to attack the French, and on the evening of November the 24th, they heard a huge explosion as the French destroyed their remaining gunpowder, abandoning the fort. Forbes took possession of the site the next day, November 25th, and began construction of a new fort that would become Fort Pitt, after William Pitt the Elder, who was instrumental in running the British government at the time. Fort Pitt grew into a very powerful Vauban-style, star-shaped defensive position with artillery pieces and the natural defence of the rivers on two sides. The fort provided protection for the settlers from any native insurrections and raids. Early in 1763, the native leader, Pontiac, had pushed the effort for a coalition of tribes to rise up against the British. The French forts and outposts around the Great Lakes region were now occupied by the victorious British, and with that, Fort Pitt, being one of the last major forts before the frontier, started to merge into civilization over the Appalachian Mountains. If this fort fell, there was no safety zone, and Native American raiding parties could come the entire way into the eastern population centres. Henry Bouquet became the commandant of Fort Pitt. He was one of the most experienced woodland commanders in North America. In January 1763, Bouquet left the fort and travelled east to Philadelphia to handle administrative duties. He left his very competent friend and protégé, Captain Simeon Ecuyer, in command. By April of 1763, relations with the Ohio Indians had become tense. A major cause of the tension was the policies of the new British commander in North America, Commander Geoffrey Amherst. Amherst did not have much respect for the Ohio Indians and instituted a revocation of gift-giving to the natives. The French had a policy of gift-giving and buying the natives' favour. It began to look more and more like the British were pursuing westward expansion into native lands. As the writing on the wall concerning British policy became clearer, Pontiac began plotting attacks on the more outlying posts, such as Fort Detroit. In May 1763, Fort Detroit came under siege, then the other frontier forts, Forts Le Boeuf and Fort Presque Isle, and finally Fort Venago. The attack on Fort Venago was pretty ingenious and insidious. The natives challenged the British garrison and settlers to a game of lacrosse, not an uncommon event. Chasing a supposedly errant lacrosse ball into the fort, the Indians grabbed weapons from spectators as they rushed into the fort in the planned deception. Venago fell easily. Over a relatively short period of time, almost all of the forts on the frontier fell to Pontiac and his allies. They continued to move east. In June, farms and settlements near Fort Pitt began to come under attack, and then finally, on June 22nd, Fort Pitt was under siege. It was a well-built fort with over a dozen artillery pieces, and easily repelled the native assaults, but the population in the fort ballooned as the surrounding settlers flowed in for protection. The larger population meant that supplies were going to be a problem as the Ohio Indians settled in to starve the British out. Word filtered back to Amherst that Fort Pitt was under siege, and that most of the other frontier forts were lost. Bouquet was ordered to organise a relief column and move on the fort to relieve the siege with the 60th Royal Americans. He was also assigned the 42nd Highlanders, the vaunted Black Watch, and the 77th Highlanders. The Highlanders at the time were waiting in a port in New York City to return home after duty in the Caribbean, and most of them were already battling malaria and other tropical diseases before being redirected to the relief column. In total, Bouquet had about 400 to 500 troops, plus wagoneers bringing supplies to the beleaguered fort. The march proceeded along Forbes Road, which mirrors the modern Pennsylvania Turnpike and Route 30 across most of the length of the state of Pennsylvania. Guyasuta, a Mingo chief, and Kikiuskung, a Delaware chief, led the siege force that included Mingo, Shawnee, Huron, and some Delaware tribe members that we refer collectively to as the Ohio Indians. Their number were estimated anywhere from 100 to 400 combatants. As Bouquet's relief column drew closer, Ecuyer and the rest of the garrison had no idea they were coming, but could only hope. The fort entered into several parleys with the natives. Guyasuta told Ecuyer that all of the other forts to his east had fallen. His supply line and hope of relief were gone. He continued to hope in his friend and commander for salvation, but conditions were beginning to look desperate for the British. Ecuyer even resorted to offering the natives blankets and supplies infected by smallpox sufferers in the fort's infirmary. It was the first instance of international biological warfare in North America. Coincidentally and controversially, Amherst at around the same time approved the same tactic for use all over North America. There is no evidence, though, that the tainted supplies from the fort caused an outbreak of smallpox in the region. As Bouquet steadily moved toward Fort Pitt, he stopped at Fort Ligonier, about 50 miles out, to switch supplies from the wagon train to pack horses to make the remainder of the trip at a quicker pace. He planned to march to Bushy Run Station, a small outpost about halfway to Fort Pitt from Ligonier, that had been abandoned due to the siege and the native activity in the area. By the way, a run, as in Bushy Run, is another name for a stream, and Bushy Run Station was a perfect place to refill water and have a short rest before continuing on. A few days into August, both the attacks and the number of Ohio Indians around Fort Pitt seemed to drop. It almost seemed as if there was no longer a siege. The natives knew that a relief column was coming. They had received word that it was close and dropped the siege to ambush the column before it could resupply the fort. Gayasuta knew exactly where he should attack the column. The day had been hot. The British had been marching all morning with the promise of water and a rest at Bushy Run. Just before Bushy Run there was a deep valley that would be perfect for an ambush. In the early afternoon, with the Royal Americans leading, the relief column entered the base of the valley. They were just a mile out from Bushy Run Station, and the first musket shots of the Battle of Bushy Run rang out. Bouquet sent the Highlanders forward to support the Royal Americans as the native forces fired down from high ground behind the cover of old-growth trees into the valley below. Instead of having his troops stay in battle line formation and use volley fire against the attacks, Bouquet used a relatively unconventional strategy. The Highlanders fixed bayonets and moved into the woods to attack the Indians. The natives fell back to regroup and renewed the attack elsewhere. This went on for hours as the natives withdrew, repositioned, and attacked again. Bouquet withdrew a short distance back up the hill from the valley to Edge Hill, which was a small yet clear hilltop with one side protected by a drop-off. He had his men create a small redoubt using the flour bags to protect the growing number of wounded and the pack animals. Kiciuskung spoke English well and taunted the British all day. It is rumoured he repeatedly called out that he would have Bouquet's scalp before evening. Finally, darkness fell on August 5th, and the British settled in for a long night in and around their flour bag redoubt. A monument of cement flour bags is still present on Edge Hill. The native forces left the British relatively unaccosted overnight, and Bouquet penned a dispatch to Amherst describing their plight. Bouquet knew he could not have another battle in the morning like he did the day before. He couldn't lose any more men and still be a viable force. He knew the attacking natives often left outs for opponents during a battle. It was easier and safer to chase down and slaughter a retreating enemy than to force them to fight to the last man in a desperate battle. Bouquet would take advantage of this. As the fighting renewed the next day, a few companies of Highlanders under Major Allen Campbell were ordered to fall back to the Flour Redoubt and then march east back down the road to Ligonier, which appeared not defended and was the out that the natives had left them. This gave the appearance that they were retreating. Bouquet had planned their fake retreat and was hoping for the natives to rush into the south-facing gap left by the Highlanders that they thought were retreating. This had been a tactic in fighting the whites over and over, incite a retreat and then chase after the retreating soldiers and massacre them. The natives left the tree line and were racing to the Flour Redoubt, assaulting the thinned British line, just as Bouquet had expected. They were met by a powerful volley from the British, who were reinforced behind the flour bags waiting for them. At the same time, the companies under Campbell that were faking a retreat had swung back around and assaulted the natives' right flank with a bayonet charge. It came as a complete surprise. The natives started taking heavy casualties, and broke and ran, heading back west. The Highlanders pursued them to the ridge above Bushy Run, but the battle was over. The Ohio Indians could not suffer such high casualties, and they would not renew the battle. The British buried their dead in a mass grave that to this day has not been identified on the battlefield. The siege of Fort Pitt was lifted, and Mackay marched into Fort Pitt on August the 11th. Would you like to write a script for us, just as Doug did for this episode? Don't be daunted by the prospect of writing a script for us. We are happy to help you. So just come up with an idea and let's get started, and let's help each other with the writing of that script. We love getting your ideas, so do drop us those at info@thehistorynetwork.org. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Doug Nipple, read by Nick Barker.